Hello, class. This is your lecture on plant growth. Let's get started. Processes in plants change over time. First, we have change in each developmental stage. That is to say, plants germinate, they grow. If they're a flowering plant, they flower and fruit, and then they die. Another way that plants change is in response to environmental factors. For example, plants might grow in response to light, or they might germinate their seeds in response to moisture. Now, certain environmental factors may only lead to a specific response in a certain developmental stage of that plant's life. And we're going to hopefully understand by the end of this lecture just how such changes and responses are regulated. For example, you might have heard of the century plant. The century plant grows 25 years or more before it is ready to respond to the environmental cues that induce its flowering. And its flowering stalk is huge. It can be 10 times bigger than the plant itself. Our outline for plant growth is as follows. We'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll talk about nutrients, vitamins, and hormones. We'll talk about hormonal interactions, and then we'll launch into plant movements. We'll talk about photoperiodism, and then we'll talk about phytochromes and cryptochromes and their role in plant growth. We'll discuss a hypothesis for a flowering hormone, and then finally we'll end this lecture with some information about temperature and growth. First, some definitions. Growth is defined as irreversible increase in mass due to division and enlargement of cells. And we can break down growth into two types. Determinate growth, in which the plant grows, stops growing, and dies in one growing season, and indeterminate growth, in which the plant or parts of the plant grow and continue to be active for several to many years. Now, in general, plants that are referred to as annuals tend to have determinate growth. They tend to live and die in one season. Plants that are called perennials usually have indeterminate growth, in which, as long as the conditions are correct, they can continue to grow and be active for several to many years. The next term is differentiation. This refers to the fact that cells develop different forms adapted to specific functions. Next is development. This refers to a coordination of growth and differentiation of a single cell into tissues and organs. For example, at a shoot apical meristem, we will see differentiation and development occurring in chronological order. Our next terms are nutrients and vitamins. Nutrients are those substances that furnish elements and energy to produce organic molecules. Nutrients are typically obtained from the air or from the soil. Vitamins, on the other hand, are organic molecules of varied structure that participate in catalyzed reactions, mostly by functioning as electron acceptors or electron donors. Vitamins are synthesized most often in cell membranes and the cytoplasm of our plants, and vitamins are required in very small amounts for normal growth and development. Hormones, on the other hand, are produced in plants, and this production is dictated by the genes. Mostly hormones are produced in the actively growing regions, which is typically going to be in those meristems. They are produced in and active in smaller amounts than both vitamins and enzymes. So very tiny fractions of a percent of any given substance will be composed of these hormones. Hormones are often transported in the xylem or the phloem, depending on where they were produced, and they are transported to where the hormone's effect is needed. It's worth noting that the effects of vitamins are often similar to those of hormones, and thus they can be difficult to distinguish the effects of each in any given plant. Hormones can often have multiple effects. Hormones act by chemically binding to specific receptors. For example, a hormone receptor association will initiate some effect in our plant. This might, for example, trigger a series of biochemical events, including the turning of genes on and or off. Now let's look at a short list of the hormones that are important to know for my course. First, the auxins. Auxins have several major functions, including they stimulate stem and root growth through cell elongation. They promote apical dominance, which we will define very soon. They regulate fruit development, and they induce growth towards the light. There are some commercial uses for auxin. For example, they can be used to promote root formation in stem cuttings, and this is going to make for an easier plant propagation process. Our next group of hormones is the cytokinins. Remember this root word cyto? Previously we saw that cell division was called cytokinesis. So this is all about splitting up something. Therefore, one of the major functions of cytokinins is all about stimulating cell division and cell growth. It also is important that cytokinins are used for root growth and root cell differentiation. Cytokinins counteract apical dominance, and in some cases they also slow aging. Cytokinins may be used commercially. For example, in biotechnology, cytokinins are used to produce cell cultures for plant propagations and experiments. Next is the gibberellins. Gibberellins stimulate cell elongation. That's one of their number one uses in plants. They also promote seed germination and bud growth, and they stimulate flowering and fruit development in the angiosperms. Gibberellins are used commercially. For example, in agriculture, particularly in grapes, gibberellins are used to promote stem elongation and fruit size. Larger grapes have a higher market value, and they also, when treated with gibberellins, have fewer problems with fungus and bacteria. Next up is abscisic acid, or ABA for short. This hormone functions to inhibit growth, to close the stomata during drought stress, and to promote seed dormancy. Now, while ABA is very important, there aren't a lot of commercial uses that I've heard of. And the last hormone we're going to need to learn for this class is ethylene. And ethylene functions primarily in the angiosperms to ripen fruit. It also promotes the thickening of some stems and roots, and in deciduous species, it promotes leaf abscission, which is that process by which leaves fall off. Now, ethylene is often used commercially, particularly for fruits that are harvested in South America and then transported to North America for consumption. The fruits are harvested when they're completely unripe, so they will be very green in appearance, and then shipped thousands of miles to the other part of the world where they're going. And then finally, ethylene can be used to help induce a rapid fruit ripening. Often, hormones interact within the plant's tissues and organs. An example is apical dominance. Apical dominance is the suppression of the growth of lateral or axillary buds. And this suppression is brought about by an auxin-like inhibitor in a terminal bud. If cytokinins are applied in appropriate concentration to the axillary buds, they will begin to grow, even in the presence of a terminal bud. Therefore, cytokinins may counteract this apical dominance when needed by the plant. Senescence is defined as the breakdown of cellular components and membranes, eventually leading to the death of the cell. This process is used when plants need to do self-pruning. For example, they might need to shed some leaves or even shed some roots due to disease or competition or seasonal and environmental conditions. And senescence is often controlled by multiple hormones. Now we're going to move into plant movements, and we're going to learn a few of these plant movements for this course. I will mention there's a great PBS Nature documentary that you might have access to. It's called What Plants Talk About, and it does stream on Amazon if you happen to have an account. Growth movements result from varying growth rates in different parts of an organ. Now, there's different categories of these movements, and the first group of movements results primarily from internal stimuli. Examples include nutations. These are the spiraling movements that are not visible to the naked eye. Next is nodding movements. These are side-to-side oscillations. And finally, twining movements. These are from stem and leaf tendrils most often. Another group of movements are those resulting from external stimuli. The word that describes permanent movements from external stimuli is tropisms. And we're going to learn a list of different types of tropisms in just a moment. Overall, we can define tropisms as the growth of a plant towards or away from a stimulus. And this growth can be divided into three phases. First is the initial perception, in which the organ receives a greater stimulus on one side than the other. Next is the transduction, in which one or more hormones becomes unevenly distributed across the organ. And finally, asymmetrical growth occurs, and this results in a greater cell elongation on one side of the plant organ. The first plant movement that we need to learn is phototropism. Phototropism refers to growing towards or away from the light. Positive phototropism is growth towards a light source. This occurs when auxin migrates away from light, and it accumulates in greater amounts on the opposite side, promoting a greater elongation of cells on the dark side, and thus pushing the plant tissues and organs towards the light. Negative phototropism, on the other hand, is growth away from the light. This is often seen in roots. Roots will either be insensitive or negatively phototrophic. Our next tropism is gravitropism, and this is response to gravity. Now, growth responses to the stimulus of gravity can be either positively gravitrophic or negatively gravitrophic. In general, primary plant roots are positively gravitrophic, while shoot systems are negatively gravitrophic. Also, in the root tips, we often find amyloplasts that settle on the bottom of the tip, causing auxin to redistribute, which causes these roots to continue growing deeper and deeper into the ground. Other unique tropisms include the following list, but the only one that I focus on for our class is a thigmotropism. This is response to physical contact, and we often see this as a response to different types of leaves or flower parts. Thigmo is Latin for the word touch, and therefore physical contact will cause the part to move. Another group of plant movements are the turgor movements, and these are typically going to be about changing water pressure across cell tissues. Turgor movements result from changes in internal water pressure and are often initiated by contact with objects outside of the plant. This is often by special groups of cells called the Pulvini cells found at the base of the organ that moves. Turgor contact movements, however, are not just confined to leaves. Many flower parts also exhibit movement of stamens or other sexual reproduction parts that facilitate pollination. Our next plant movement is circadian rhythms. A circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle in a physiological or biochemical process in our plants, and it's based on sensing light. Pigments that sense light help control gene expression and the subsequent movements that occur. Now, several different plant families tend to often have these circadian rhythms in that their leaves and or petals fold in regular daily cycles. Typically, they unfold in the morning and then they fold up for protection in the evening. And this is all controlled by the biological clock that is ultimately the result of cryptochrome pigments doing their job. Next up is solar tracking. In this process, it's only leaves that follow this movement. It's never flowers, in which the leaves twist on their petioles and in response to illumination move towards the light. Now, this is sometimes referred to as a heliotropism, but notice this term is in quotation marks because no growth is involved. Instead, this is usually a turgor movement. Water conservation is seen in many grasses and other organisms. This is the process in which special thin-walled cells lose their turgor pressure. This, in effect, causes the leaves to roll up or fold during periods of drought. Photoperiodism refers to the fact that day length is directly related to the onset of flowering in many plants. And we can break down photoperiodism into several different types of plant groups. In either case, photosensitive pigments are signaled by light and gene expression occurs. Short day plants will not flower unless the day length is shorter than a critical period. For example, we'll see this in species that do a spring or a fall bloom. Examples include dahlias, poinsettias, and strawberries. Long day plants, on the other hand, will not flower unless periods of light are longer than a critical period. For example, summer blooming species. An example is California poppies. Intermediate day plants will not flower if the days are too short or too long. So they need about 12 to 14 hours of daylight every day. So because of that, we often see these down by the equator. Many tropical species, including grasses. And then lastly, day-neutral plants. These will flower under any day length, provided they receive the minimum amount of light necessary for normal growth. We often see these with more weedy types of species, things like dandelions, but also species such as sunflowers. Now we'll say a word about phytochromes. So phytochromes are pigments that control this photoperiodism process. And the active form of phytochrome exists when red light is predominant and encourages leaf expansion, chlorophyll development, and other characteristics of plants growing in the full sun. In contrast, the inactive form of phytochrome occurs when red light is reduced, either at night when there's no light, or in shaded conditions where far red light is predominant. Far red light occurs just outside of our range of visual perception, but is absorbed by the phytochrome. From a practical standpoint, this means a plant can tell whether or not its light environment is limited. Both red and blue light are absorbed by chlorophyll, so a low level of red light means poor photosynthetic conditions. Under such conditions, Inactive phytochrome causes many plants to become etiolated, which means they have abnormally long stems, in an attempt to outgrow the shade before it starves from lack of carbohydrate production. Phytochromes are all pale blue proteinaceous pigments that ultimately absorb light. To compare and contrast, phytochromes play a role in other plant responses as well, and they often work alongside of these cryptochromes. Phytochromes might direct rapid growth towards the sun in an attempt to survive. They can detect shading and respond appropriately. Cryptochromes, which are also blue light-sensitive pigments, might play a role in circadian rhythms and interact with phytochromes to, again, control these plant reactions to the light. Cryptochromes play a role in the greening of these etiolated leaves, these leaves that have lost their chlorophyll and have become very long in shape. Florigen is a hypothesized hormone-like molecule responsible for controlling and or triggering flowering in plants. And it's typically going to be transported from the leaf to the apical meristems where the flower buds are initiated. In the last part of this lecture, we're going to talk about temperature and growth. Each plant species has an optimum temperature for growth and a minimum temperature below which growth will not occur. Thermoperiod refers to this optimum night and day temperature at which plants are the most successful. Optimum temperatures may change with the growth stage of the plant, and lower night temperatures often result in higher sugar content and greater root growth. Some plants have evolved to grow in very warm regions, while others have evolved to be most successful in a cool environment. All right, well, that's our summary for all things plant growth. We've now done a brief introduction and did an overview of nutrients, vitamins, and hormones. We learned a short list of hormones to know for the exam, as well as talked about hormonal interactions. We talked about plant movements, photoperiodism, and phytochromes versus cryptochromes. Lastly, we talked about a flowering hormone, and we talked about temperature and growth and their effects on plants. Please email me with any questions, and thank you for listening.